Have you wondered, when a mage casts a spell in WoW, are they repeating a phrase? Do they use some specific language, maybe, Pelasia, in their casting? Well, the use of spoken verbal words or incantations by mages varies greatly in Warcraft. Today, we'll go over some examples that show how characters in the lore cast big, complex spells with the help of words and incantations. On the other hand, we'll also see how player characters fit into this, and whether they too use the help of spoken incantations in their spell work. When a character casts a spell, you can notice a couple of things at a glance. One is that their arms may be moving as well as their hands. The completion of a spell involves the caster moving their arms upward or toward the enemy in which one is casting, thus completing the spell. So all spellcasting comes with some sort of gesture, as seen in the animations associated with spells. Other things that might be required in the casting of a spell are reagents, which are items of power, specifically needed to be able to cast certain spells that are then consumed in the process. One example of this was, prior to the Cataclysm, player mages would use portal runes to be able to cast a portal spell. The item would then be consumed upon use. The last component that is sometimes needed for a spell is a verbal requirement, a specific phrase or a word of power which gives life to a spell. A spell will use at least one of these things, and usually all three. In the book Cycle of Hatred, Chapter 8, we find a passage spoken by Jaina in which she says, "Every wizard wielded the forces of magic differently, and if one was sensitive enough, one could tell the differences from one mage to the next." So clearly, some mages do rely on spoken words more than others in their casting, and this differs from mage to mage. The use of a verbal component is also represented in the spells Silence, Strangulate, Silencing Shot, and even Curse of Tongues. Each of these spells stops the caster from being able to cast spells by merit of not allowing them to speak, and Curse of Tongues slows the casting of spells by making the person speak in demonic for the rest of their casting. Likewise, priests have Shadow Word Pain and Shadow Word Death, which speak words to inflict shadow damage to their targets. Inversely, as you can see, Power Word Life uses a spoken word to heal a target with holy power. The ability for silent spells to affect all spellcasts is a gameplay feature, because if only some spells actually required verbal components, then the silence would only be able to block those particular spells, and that would be a little bit too complicated. One item that players might be familiar with much earlier in WoW's history were spell scrolls. Spells could be stored within a scroll, and if the words were read aloud, its magic would be consumed and unleashed. So with all this, we see that verbal components are actually a very common occurrence in the casting of spells in World of Warcraft. The book The Last Guardian describes the importance of following the spell's components, such as when you change a hand motion or you do not use the required incense, most of the times result in failure, with energies of the spell dissipating. Occasionally, the energies from the spell may go wild and out of control, but usually this results in a failed spell. Changing the incantation or altering the motions of your hands or body was not enough to refit a spell for a new activity. When you change an existing spell, it requires a deep and precise understanding of how the spell works. And actually, this activity is more dangerous than simply following a list of components, as a failed spell would be very close to the final intended spell and would lead to the magics trying to close the gap, though resulting in some unintended results or a spectacular and dangerous failure. We obviously don't see this happen in-game due to gameplay reasons, though it is an occurrence in the lore that is firmly established. It also insinuates that more powerful characters in the lore may have at one time needed the use of a verbal component for some spells, but later adapted the spell to no longer need it. In the background of this video and the footage, you've been able to see multiple different NPCs using casting animations, casting spells. Some of them using words, as you can see their mouths moving, but most of the time it's in the use of hand motions and body movements. But now we can look at a few examples where in-game characters recite phrases verbally for us to hear for a powerful spell or reference their verbal component specifically. For the first example, we have Khadgar, during Warlords of Draenor, freeing Garona from the spell that makes her do Gul'dan's bidding. Let's watch.
I do not like this.
Next up, we have Khadgar yet again, speaking an incantation to find Gul'dan during the legendary quest for the ring in Warlords of Draenor. Next, we have the Kirin Tor Council of Six, granting the player character their power to unlock further power in their artifacts during the 7.2 content of Legion.
Together, we must all lend our strength.
Next up, we can see an incantation spoken by a warlock in the opening of the Warlock Order Hall during the start of
The
Legion.
ritual begins.
Be prepared. We're reaching deeper into the nether than ever before. Who knows what we may find?
Next, we can see Thalysra recite some magic incantation during her magic message spoken to the Council of Six and the player character at the beginning of the Suramar campaign.
Ethel Kanesh.
And finally, we have Jaina referencing her verbal incantation component when casting her spell to bring down the walls in the Halls of Reflection.
Another ice wall! Keep the undead from interrupting my incantation so that I may bring this wall down!
Though one could argue that she isn't actually referencing a verbal component, and that she is just speaking about her incantation in general. So I thought I'd include it here either way. Those are some great examples of major lore characters using verbal components in their spellcasting that we can actually hear during gameplay. Another great visual example we can see is Thrall, who is surrounded by the aspects on the summit of Wyrmrest Temple, casting a very large spell with the Dragon Soul in the middle of them, as we take on Ultraxion. You can see his lips are in constant movement, as whatever spell he is casting is needing him to use many words. We can also take a look here at Ysera, who's also speaking verbal incantations in this scene. So both of these things really adds gravity to the power of the spell that they're casting in the raid, which has all the aspects powers combined to take down Deathwing into the Dragon Soul. One final thing I could mention, although it's not strictly canon, but I'd remiss to not include it, is the Warcraft movie, which was specifically designed to have magic in it that required verbal components for every spell done. And throughout the movie, we can see Khadgar speaking words that invoke every spell that he does. At one point, Lothar even covers his mouth to stop him from casting his spell, and the spell fades out, losing its power. Here I'll show some examples found in the movie, along with a screen grab from the scene in which it is located. The first one is Shalarath, Shalaros, which is multiple arcane missiles. Lui Sharath, Lui Shalath, Ri Shalath, which is one big arcane missile. Uramar Hakar, Uramar Hakas, Ulamar Hakar, which are small arcane shield dome. Shir Thala, which is the beginning of an arcane incantation. Shir Thalar Kathar, Karthal, some kind of arcane pushing force, which Khadgar holds Garona up against a tree. Sotrak, Soltrak Unar Kalador. This is Medivh's lightning wall. Shath Ariath, which is a fireball. Al-Parathras Akar Mudathar. This is Khadgar's teleportation spell, in this instance, him teleporting to Karazhan. So, with all these examples, you can see that mages do in fact use verbal components sometimes when they cast spells in the World of Warcraft. The spells usually are of a larger or more complex type when done by major characters such as Khadgar, Thrall, or Jaina. And though it seems to be implied that the player character does indeed use verbal components to some spells, some of the time, by existence of silent spells, which are used to counteract them. Personally, I really do enjoy the different components that are to casting in Azeroth, as it adds a layer of complexity to the world, and fleshes out the magic system more. I hope you found this lore video elucidating and enlightening. Please join me again to discuss more mundane, obscure lore in the World of Warcraft. This is Stormwind University, signing off.